Throwaway account. I'm 34M, my wife is 32F. Married 6 years, together almost 10. We've always described our relationship as built on trust. No phone checking. No tracking locations. No interrogations about who's texting who. We were proud of that. I thought it meant we were solid. She used to say, "If you don't trust me, why be with me?" And I agreed. Completely. I didn't want to be controlling. I didn't want to be suspicious. I wanted to be the kind of partner who felt safe, not insecure. So when little things changed, I ignored them. When she started keeping her phone face down, I told myself I was imagining patterns. When she began going on more work dinners, I reminded myself she'd earned my trust. When she stopped sharing details about her day, I assumed she was tired. Everyone goes through phases. The first moment that unsettled me came one night when she laughed at her phone. Really laughed. I looked up, smiled, asked what was funny. She hesitated, then said, "Just something stupid." And that was it. No follow-up. No instinct to share. I let it go, because letting it go was what trust looked like to me. What I didn't realize yet was that trust without curiosity can quietly turn into absence, and that sometimes not asking questions doesn't make you secure. It just makes you uninformed. At the time, I still believed silence was respect. I didn't know yet how expensive that belief was about to become. Once I noticed a shift, I started noticing it everywhere. Not in obvious ways. Nothing I could point to and say, "That's the problem." Just small absences. Missing details. Conversations that ended sooner than they used to. Answers that were technically replies, but didn't invite anything back. The twist was how normal it all looked. She was still affectionate. Still asked about my day. Still said, "Love you" before bed. If I'd been looking for proof something was wrong, I wouldn't have found it. But I wasn't looking for proof. I was feeling a slow, dull confusion I couldn't explain. When I asked about her day, she'd say, "It was fine," and move on. No stories. No complaints. No little observations like she used to share. I told myself this was adulthood. Less narration, more efficiency. Still, I missed the way we used to talk. I tried sharing more from my side, hoping it would open things up. She listened politely, nodded, then checked her phone. Not rudely, casually, like her attention was divided in a way it hadn't been before. One night, I asked if everything was okay between us. She looked genuinely surprised and said, "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" The question made me feel foolish for asking. I dropped it immediately. That's when I realized something unsettling. Trust had become my reason not to ask follow-up questions. Every time curiosity bubbled up, I shut it down myself. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to be that guy. But silence has a way of expanding when you don't question it. And slowly, without either of us saying it out loud, answers were being replaced by distance, and I was the only one pretending that was okay. The realization came late, after midnight, in one of those quiet moments where your thoughts get louder because there's nothing else to distract you. She'd gone to bed early, phone in hand like usual. I stayed up, scrolling aimlessly, replaying the day in my head. I noticed how many gaps there were. Not lies, not contradictions, just missing pieces I've been automatically filling in for her. If she was late, I assumed traffic. If she seemed distant, I assumed stress. If she guarded her phone, I assumed privacy. I was doing a lot of emotional labor just to keep the story of us intact. That was a twist. Nothing felt wrong enough to confront, but nothing felt solid enough to relax into either. I realized I couldn't actually describe her life anymore. I didn't know who she spent most of her time with. I didn't know what she was excited about. I didn't know what was bothering her, if anything even was. And the scary part was how long that had been true without me noticing. I thought back to how we used to talk. The oversharing, the pointless details, the way she'd tell me stories that went nowhere just because she liked hearing my reactions. Somewhere along the way, that stopped, and I'd accepted the silence as maturity. Lying there in the dark, it hit me. Trust shouldn't require this much guesswork. It shouldn't feel like I'm maintaining a version of reality alone. I wasn't avoiding questions because I trusted her. I was avoiding them because I was afraid of what answers might confirm. And once I admitted that to myself, the silence didn't feel respectful anymore. It felt intentional. The next evening, I noticed myself doing something new. I didn't rush to explain things away. I didn't jump in to soften the edges of her answers. I just listened, watched, let the silence sit where it landed. She came home later than usual and set her phone on the counter, screen down. Normally, I would have looked away immediately, like noticing would make me guilty of something. This time, I didn't stare either. I just registered it, like data, not accusation. When I asked how her day was, she said, busy, and when to change. No details. No invitation. I waited, half expecting her to circle back. She didn't. We ate dinner mostly quietly. She laughed at something on her phone and angled the screen away without thinking. That was a twist. It wasn't secrecy anymore. It was habit. Later, while we were watching TV, she got a message and stepped into the hallway to answer it. Not dramatically. Casually. Like this was normal now. My chest tightened, but I didn't follow her with questions. I didn't want to turn observation into confrontation before I understood what I was seeing. I realized something uncomfortable in that moment. I'd been protecting her from my curiosity more than I'd been protecting the relationship. I treated questions like threats instead of bridges. And without bridges, all you're left with is distance that slowly hardens into fact. That night, lying next to her, I felt more awake than I had in weeks. Because once you stop looking away, you start seeing patterns. And patterns don't need accusations to exist. They just need honesty long enough to be recognized. After that night, I couldn't unsee the imbalance. Trust, I realized, had turned into something I was practicing alone. I was still open, still available, still answering questions without hesitation. She, on the other hand, had become careful in ways that felt selective, not mutual. The twist was how subtle it all was. If I asked who she was texting, she'd answer, but vaguely, just work stuff. A friend. Never names unless I asked directly. And when I did ask directly, there was a pause. Not long enough to call out, but long enough to notice. I told myself not to overthink it. I'd spent years training myself not to. One night, I mentioned an old coworker who'd reached out to me. She asked follow-up questions immediately. Who was it? Why now? What did they want? Her curiosity was sharp, focused, engaged. I answered easily because there was nothing to hide. That contrast stayed with me. I realized I wasn't against questions. I welcomed them. I saw them as interest, not suspicion. Somewhere along the way, she'd started treating questions like intrusions, things that deflect rather than answer. And that's when it hit me. Trust isn't just about not asking questions. It's about being answerable. It's about openness that doesn't require pressure. And lately, all the openness was flowing in one direction. That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't snoop. I didn't accuse. I just sat with the discomfort and let it exist without rushing to fix it. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to preserve the idea that everything was fine. I was trying to understand whether it actually was. And that felt like a line I couldn't uncross anymore. The question had been there for a while, hovering just out of reach. I'd feel it rise up, then push it back down with the same reflex every time. Don't be suspicious. Don't be controlling. Don't ruin what you have. Trust, I reminded myself, meant restraint. But restraint started feeling less like maturity and more like avoidance. One evening, we were cleaning up after dinner when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, smiled quickly, and slid it into her pocket. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one I'd learned to ignore. This time, I didn't. I asked, as casually as I could, "Who was that?" She shrugged. "Just a friend." That was it. No name, no context, just enough information to end the conversation. And I let it end, out of habit more than choice. But something about it felt different this time. Heavier, like I just watched the door close that used to stay open. The twist came a few minutes later, when she asked me who had called me earlier in the day. I told her, gave details, told a short story about the conversation. She nodded, satisfied, and moved on. I stood there realizing how automatic that had been for me and how intentional the silence had been for her. It wasn't that I wanted to interrogate her. I just wanted the kind of openness that doesn't require careful wording, the kind we used to have, the kind that made questions unnecessary because answers came freely. That night, lying awake, I admitted something I hadn't wanted to face. I wasn't avoiding questions because I trusted her. I was avoiding them because I was scared of confirming that I was the only one still playing by those rules. A few days later, I finally asked a question I couldn't soften or disguise. We were sitting at the kitchen table, nothing tense in the air, when I said, "Do you feel like you tell me everything anymore?" I didn't accuse. I didn't list examples. I just asked. She looked up, surprised, but not offended. Then she said, "I don't think I need to share everything." The words were calm, reasonable. They would have sounded healthy a year ago. This time, they landed differently. That was the twist. It wasn't what she said, it was how final it felt. Not defensive, not unsure, just decided. Like she'd already drawn a boundary I was only now noticing. I nodded, said I understood. And I did, intellectually. Emotionally, something shifted. After that, I started hearing her words through a new filter. "I'm just busy" sounded like "I'm elsewhere." "It's nothing" sounded like "it's not for you." Even affection felt compartmentalized, present but contained, like something she turned on and off rather than shared. I realized I'd been confusing trust with access. I thought trusting each other meant we didn't need to guard information. She saw trust as the freedom to keep parts of her life separate without explanation. Neither definition was wrong, but they were incompatible. That night, I lay awake thinking about how many things I didn't know anymore. Not secrets necessarily, just pieces I was no longer invited into. And the scariest part wasn't that she'd changed. It was that she seemed perfectly comfortable with the distance. Once you notice that, it's hard not to wonder what else has been quietly reclassified as not yours to know. A few days later, I finally asked a question I couldn't soften or disguise. We were sitting at the kitchen table, nothing tense in the air, when I said, "Do you feel like you tell me everything anymore?" I didn't accuse. I didn't list examples. I just asked. She looked up, surprised, but not offended. Then she said, "I don't think I need to share everything." The words were calm, reasonable. They would have sounded healthy a year ago. This time, they landed differently. That was a twist. It wasn't what she said, it was how final it felt. Not defensive, not unsure, just decided. Like she'd already drawn a boundary I was only now noticing. I nodded, said I understood. And I did, intellectually. Emotionally, something shifted. After that, I started hearing her words through a new filter. "I'm just busy" sounded like "I'm elsewhere." "It's nothing" sounded like "it's not for you." Even affection felt compartmentalized, present but contained, like something she turned on and off rather than shared. I realized I'd been confusing trust with access. I thought trusting each other meant we didn't need to guard information. She saw trust as the freedom to keep parts of her life separate without explanation. Neither definition was wrong, but they were incompatible. That night, I lay awake thinking about how many things I didn't know anymore. Not secrets necessarily, just pieces I was no longer invited into. And the scariest part wasn't that she'd changed. It was that she seemed perfectly comfortable with the distance. Once you notice that, it's hard not to wonder what else has been quietly reclassified as not yours to know. After that conversation, I stopped listening only to her answers and started noticing what she offered freely. The difference was stark. She'd tell me about neutral things, traffic, meetings, errands. Anything that couldn't lead anywhere emotional. But moments that carried energy, laughter, or tension were edited down or skipped entirely. That was a twist. I realized she wasn't secretive across the board. She was selective. The parts of her day that felt alive were kept private. The parts that felt administrative were shared. It was like being given a receipt instead of the experience. One night, She mentioned grabbing drinks after work. I asked who with. She said, a couple people, and changed the subject. The next morning, she was unusually upbeat, humming while making coffee. I asked how the drinks were. Fine, she said, already moving on. The contrast between her mood and her words fell off, like a sentence with the middle cut out. I didn't push. I just noticed. I noticed how she'd light up when her phone buzzed and dull when I spoke. How she'd step away to take calls, but never explained why. How she'd share plans once they were already set, not while they were forming. It wasn't deceit in the obvious sense. It was curation. That's when it hit me. Intimacy isn't about knowing everything. It's about being considered while things are happening. I wasn't being considered anymore. I was being informed after the fact. Sometimes not even that. The trust I'd been so proud of suddenly fell hollow. Not because I suspected betrayal, but because openness had become optional. And once openness is optional, trust stops being mutual. It becomes something one person gives, while the other decides how much to receive. And that realization stayed with me longer than I expected. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no discovery, no smoking gun. It came during a casual conversation about weekend plans. I mentioned we could invite some friends over, and she hesitated, just slightly, before saying she already had plans. I asked what they were. She said, just something I forgot to tell you about. That sentence lingered, not because forgetting is a crime, but because it had become a pattern. Plans appeared fully formed, already lived through, and I was informed afterward, if at all. I realized how often I'd been treating that as normal, as respect, as trust. The twist came when I imagined reversing the roles. If I'd made plans without mentioning them, if I'd been vague about who I was with, if I'd guarded my phone the way she did, she would have noticed immediately. She would have asked questions, and I would have answered them without hesitation. That's when it hit me. Trust had become asymmetrical. I was transparent by default. She was selective by design. And I was the only one calling that balance healthy. I wasn't being trusted more. I was being expected to trust more, without the same access in return. That night, I stopped trying to reassure myself. I didn't look for evidence. I didn't spiral. I just let the realization sit. Mutual trust doesn't require one person to constantly prove they're not suspicious. If trust only works when one person stays curious and the other stays guarded, it isn't trust. It's compliance. And once I saw that clearly, the quiet between us stopped feeling neutral. It started feeling like a choice, one she was making every day, and one I was finally allowed to question. Once I stopped calling my question suspicion, something shifted inside me. I realized curiosity isn't the enemy of trust. It's part of it. Wanting to understand your partner's life doesn't make you controlling. It means you're still invested. I've been treating my own instincts like something dangerous that needed to be suppressed. The twist came when I stopped suppressing them. I didn't accuse her. I didn't interrogate. I just asked normal questions and didn't rush to soften them. If she said she was meeting someone, I asked who. If she said she'd be late, I asked why. Calmly, casually, the way partners used to talk before everything became so carefully managed. She noticed immediately. Not because the questions were aggressive, but because they were new. She answered, but with a slight edge now, like she was deciding how much to give me rather than speaking freely. Why do you need to know? She asked once, half joking. I told her the truth, because I like knowing what's going on in your life. She didn't laugh. That moment told me everything. Curiosity made her uncomfortable because it disrupted the dynamic she'd grown used to, one where information flowed on her terms. And trust meant I didn't ask for more. That night, I realized something important. If simple interest feels intrusive to someone, it's usually because they've gotten used to distance being unquestioned. And questioning distance doesn't create problems. It reveals them. I went to bed knowing this wasn't about catching her in something. It was about whether we still lived in the same emotional reality. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of finding out the answer. After I started asking simple questions, the atmosphere between us changed. Not dramatically, no arguments, no ultimatums, but there was a new tension I hadn't felt before. It wasn't anger. It was defensiveness. Like she was suddenly aware of being observed in a way she hadn't expected. That was the twist. She began answering quickly, efficiently, as if speed could replace openness. Names were given without context. Explanations were technically complete, but emotionally thin. Just work. Just friends. Nothing interesting. Every answer felt designed to end the conversation, rather than invite it forward. I noticed how often she framed my curiosity as insecurity. "You don't usually worry about this stuff," she said once, lightly. I told her I wasn't worried. I was present. The distinction seemed to frustrate her more than concern would have. One evening, she asked why I'd been paying so much attention lately. The wording stuck with me. Paying attention. Like that was a deviation from the norm instead of the baseline of intimacy. I realized in how far we drifted from a place where noticing each other was natural. The hardest part wasn't her defensiveness. It was how quickly I'd been trained to doubt myself for noticing it. I caught myself wondering if I was creating problems where none existed. That old reflex was still there, try and protect the peace by silencing curiosity. But something had changed. I didn't back down. I didn't escalate either. I just stayed present, stayed observant, stayed honest about what I felt. And in that steady attention, the distance between us stopped being abstract. It became something she actively guarded. And once someone starts guarding distance, you have to ask yourself why closeness suddenly feels like a threat. The conversation happened sooner than I expected, not because I pushed for it, but because attention had nowhere else to go. We were sitting in the living room, TV on but ignored, when she said, "I feel like you don't trust me anymore." The sentence was calm, almost rehearsed. That was a twist. She wasn't asking why. She was stating it as a conclusion. I told her I trusted her, but that trust, to me, meant openness, not silence. That it meant wanting to be part of each other's lives in real time, not just receiving summaries afterward. I said it slowly, carefully, like I was laying something fragile on the table between us. She listened, then said, "I just don't think marriage means you're entitled to every part of me." The word entitled landed hard. Not because I disagreed with the principle, but because of what it implied, that my curiosity had crossed into ownership. I realized then that we were using the same word to mean very different things. To her, trust meant autonomy without explanation. To me, trust meant access without fear. Neither was wrong, but they didn't coexist easily. And the more I tried to explain my side, the clearer it became that she felt constrained by it. Like being known to, was something she needed to protect herself from. That night, lying awake, I understood something painful but clarifying. We weren't arguing about behavior. We were arguing about belonging. And if one person experiences being known as intrusion, the distance isn't accidental. It's structural. After that conversation about trust and entitlement, I tried to sit with it. Really sit with it. I told myself maybe this was just a difference in boundaries. Maybe I needed to recalibrate what marriage meant to me now. I didn't want to jump to conclusions or turn discomfort into accusation. But once you stop ignoring patterns, details start lining up on their own. The twist came from something small she said weeks earlier, so casual I hadn't questioned at the time. She'd mentioned grabbing coffee after work with someone from another department. No name, no story, just a passing comment. Back then, I'd nodded and moved on. Now, I realized she'd mentioned that same someone more than once. Always vaguely, always without context, always followed by a quick subject change. One evening, she came home later than usual, unusually energized, talking fast, laughing. She told me about her day in broad strokes, skipping over the part where that energy clearly came from. I didn't interrupt. I didn't accuse. I just listened. Later that night, as she slept, I stared at the ceiling replaying those moments, not looking for proof, just honesty. And I realized something unsettling. She wasn't hiding everything. She was hiding specific things. And people don't do that unless they've already decided those things exist outside the relationship. Not mistakes, not slips, decisions. That was the moment I stopped asking myself whether I was being paranoid. I started asking a harder question. What kind of truth requires this much careful omission? And once that question exists, it doesn't go away. It just waits for the moment when silence stops being safer than clarity. I didn't sleep much after that realization. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind kept circling the same thought. I've been polite long enough. Every careful omission I'd noticed now felt deliberate, like she was curating a version of her life that I was allowed to see. I wasn't angry yet. I was resolved. The next evening, I asked her directly. No hedging, no jokes, no softening. I said, "Is there someone you're emotionally close to that I don't know about?" The question hung in the air longer than I expected. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me like she was deciding which language to respond in. That pause was a twist. She finally said, "I don't know why you're making this a thing." Not a denial, not reassurance, just deflection. I told her I wasn't accusing her of anything. I just wanted honesty. She sighed and said, "I talk to people. That doesn't mean anything." Again, no names, no details, just generalities designed to dissolve the question. I pressed once more. "Why does it feel like parts of your life are off limits now?" Her expression changed, then tight, controlled. She said, "Because I need space to be myself." The implication was clear. My curiosity was a problem. I realized in that moment how the conversation was being framed. If I asked for clarity, I was controlling. If I stayed silent, I was trusting. There was no room for mutual openness, only compliance. That night, we went to bed without resolving anything. But something had resolved in me. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't second-guessing my instincts. I understood the rules now. And once you understand the rules of a game that's been quietly rigged, you stop asking how to play it better. You start asking whether you want to keep playing at all. I didn't get the truth because she decided to be honest. I got it because maintaining the version she'd built became inconvenient. A few days after that conversation, she mentioned, too casually, that she might be traveling for work with a colleague. I asked who. She answered too quickly this time, like she prepared for it. A name I recognized. The same one she'd referenced before in passing. The someone from another department. Hearing it out loud connected everything instantly. I didn't react. I just asked, "How long have you been close?" She hesitated. Again, that hesitation was a truth. She said nothing physical had happened, that it was just talking, that he understood her in ways I didn't anymore, that she hadn't meant for it to go there. Every sentence was carefully shaped to avoid the word affair, while describing one perfectly. Emotional, ongoing, hidden by omission. The twist wasn't that she admitted it. It was how she justified it. She said she didn't tell me because she knew I'd overthink it, that I was safe for not knowing, that it didn't change how she felt about me. I realized then that silence hadn't been about trust. It had been about control, about managing my reactions instead of respecting my right to reality. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just felt tired in a way that reached my bones. Because everything I'd been sensing, the distance, the guardedness, the careful language, had been real. I hadn't imagined any of it. That night, lying awake, I understood something with brutal clarity. Trust doesn't break when someone lies. It breaks when someone decides you don't deserve the truth. And once that decision is made, the relationship you thought you were in no longer exists.